Sorry, I was hoping to live stream it, but it's not doing it properly. Right, I think we may as well get going. I don't want to run out of time. Okay, so welcome everyone to this, I think, a much better way to spend a commercialized Valentine's Day, while celebrating the publication of a book, which all of you, I hope, have either read it or intend to buy it. And I'll put a link up later where you can get copies. Loot, I think, have currently got it at the lowest price. They add their own discounts. Sorry, I'm just trying to put it in. Yeah. Okay. And then I also want to, I just noticed, and I'm very grateful for the attendance of Sarah Maswetsa. Oh, my mouth getting all tongue-tied. And I saw Oriel, and I think I saw there was someone else from Katlego, yeah, from NIHSS, because we really need to extend our thanks to them for supporting the Kamil's PhD, in fact, that you did at UCT, and then for funding the actual production of converting it into a book that we are also proud of now. I'm just sort of doing it slowly just to see if there's anyone else. Oops. Okay, once I stop talking, I can see them. I'm going to hand over to Kamil, and she'll give you the bit of more background about the book. Just to give you a little bit about, I think you might have seen it, but Kamil, is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Western Cape, and she did her PhD at UCT, and she did an MA as well from the University of Leeds. And believe it or not, this is her first book, so I would say a name to look out for in future scholarly events. So Kamil, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Adele. And thanks for being here, everyone. I really appreciate it. So just a little intro to what the book's about and my sort of process of writing it. I look at post-colonial crime novels with a focus on the returnee detective. So basically a detective figure who has to grapple with their own identity while they're solving a crime in their country of origin. But often we find that these supposed crimes are actually symptomatic of a much wider sort of social breakdown. We're talking about settings like wartime Sri Lanka, the aftermath of apartheid, post-collapse Somalia, and the Guatemalan Civil War. So I sort of chose this project because I noticed this as a running theme in the books I was reading. And I think probably growing up in the 90s in South Africa sort of played a role in my picking up these novels in the first place. Because they are all concerned with questions of exile, transitional justice, and how to live during or in the aftermath of systemic violence. They also depart from generic expectation by refusing to offer easy answers to the questions that they raise. In this sense, they can be a sort of frustrating or difficult read because they leave us with lingering doubts. But I like to think this constitutes quite a meaningful way of thinking about conflict resolution and justice and how we portray that. The novels withhold wish fulfillment, and in that sense, they leave us with a deeper impression, provoking a kind of discomfort and leaving us with more questions than answers. So they're effectively kind of breaking down this dialectic of guilt and innocence that we would get in traditional crime fiction, especially those which depict civil conflict, which is, of course, a lot more intimate and complex. and does not allow for sort of criminality to be isolated or even identified in a lot of cases. In the book, I sort of start with the classic old kind of detective fiction, and I look at arguments by W.H. Auden and P.D. James, which kind of hold that traditional crime stories are comforting in a counterintuitive kind of way. So they may be about murders and they may be sort of fairly gruesome, but they're consoling in the sense that while the middle of the stories are filled with suspense, we know that at the end, we're going to have a kind of revelation and a resolution. So the criminal will be revealed and we'll have all the answers by the time we get to the final pages. But the novels that I look at in this book defy that expectation. They set it up in our minds. They make us think that this is the kind of story we're going to have, but then they make a kind of departure from it. And they unravel into a kind of realism that reflects things like international complicity, the often blurred line between victim and perpetrator, and the long-reaching events of violence on nations and on individuals. And this has effects on the form of the novels, because the traditional mode is too narrow to encompass these kind of contradictions. So on that note, part of my discussion in the book focuses on this kind of relationship between the form of the book and its ideology that it's projecting. So while traditional crime stories may frame crime as an aberration by eradicating it and tying up the loose ends of narrative, different kinds of endings can address the difficulty of applying justice in violent and complicated contexts. So for example, Gillian Slobo's Red Dust addresses the TRC in South Africa, and it proceeds very differently to a traditional crime novel. It's reflecting the ambiguous effects of restorative justice through its structure. So what we get is many false endings, and the truth is never revealed to the full cast of characters, much less during the TRC proceedings themselves. I also look at Francisco Goldman's novel, The Long Night of White Chickens, which begins with a murder story set in Guatemala in the 1980s. But instead of narrowing down the suspects, the possibilities multiply throughout the book. So it widens the lens to take in the diffuse violence of the Civil War. One of the detectives refers to their investigation as being trapped in a labyrinth. And the shape of the novel echoes this with its sort of profusion of dead ends. And the protagonists struggle to find a center, to find their way back to where the trouble all began. So in these novels, the subversion of structure is an important part of world making. They defy generic expectation in order to render a more complicated view than the traditional form allows. So my other main focus, which I began with, is the idea of the returnee detective themselves. The returnee detective has become a very kind of popular character and figure in literature. And on one level, they bring a kind of human and existential dimension to the story and to the inquiry, as they try to find their place in their home countries after many years away. But their presence there also raises questions about things like the ethics of international intervention, and relative ideas of truth and justice. They can also sort of perform as a literary device. They act as multicultural mediators within the text. So interpreting for readership and perhaps even an assumed Western readership. So they perform that role as well, as devices as well as characters who are allowed to develop. So yeah, these are the issues I started off looking at in chief. But I moved from sort of just looking at the adaptation of genre to seeing the novels as having their own world-making projects. So the authors, Slovo, Goldman, Kazuo Ishiguro, Michael Ondaatje, and Neruda Farah all render the respective countries they depict really differently. And I explore which of the authors equate systemic violence with the developing countries they portray, and those who show a much broader historical picture, which encompasses issues of global complicity and our world order, rather than just, implying that these countries are sort of anarchic pockets in opposition to the stable countries that the detectives have left behind. So each book, I argue, projects a worldview in the way in which they depict the detective's sending country in comparison to their country of origin, and the degrees of worldliness and history that they bring to their depiction of post-colonial countries in a state of conflict or unrest. So some of them affirm stereotypes, while others go to great lengths to emphasize the complex relationship between the violence in the post-colony and the ostensible peaceful West. And I think that the elements of genre that authors choose to challenge and those which they hold on to can be really illuminating in terms of the worldview that they're projecting throughout the story. For example, if we look at Anil's Ghost, it's sort of subversive in the sense that it challenges the idea that atrocity can be scientifically understood and quantified. It emphasizes the idea that there needs to be a kind of intimate testimony, and underlines the limitations of the scientific point of view, which of course is unusual for a forensic thriller. But on the other hand, it very much keeps the thriller aesthetic intact. So what we end up with are victims being used to sort of heighten tension throughout the novel, and perpetrators being made sort of more frightening because we never actually get to know them as characters. So it skips over the sort of ideas of the banality of evil and how people arrive in a place where they perpetrate things like this. And in doing so, some have argued that this sort of risks sensationalizing the conflict it's depicting. Of course, when one sort of declines to explicate on the mechanics of post-colonial conflict, there's a risk of affirming stereotypes about senseless third world violence. There's also a little mention in the novel of things like the effects of colonial divide and rule as a root cause of ethnic violence. So this is one example of crime victim conventions being held onto on the one hand and being sort of let go on the other. And I think each book strikes a different balance in what they keep and what they challenge. And we can tell a lot about the sort of ideology and worldview that's being projected through the trends that they break and through those which they keep in place. So yeah, that's basically my sort of summary.
I'm not sure whether Adele is going to.
I am here.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, it's just, I don't know, I couldn't see things on my screen. Thanks, Kamil, for your introduction and sort of a brief summation of your research in your book. And now I just want to welcome Associate Professor Fiona Moolla, who's going to be in discussion with Kamil. And she is, again, as I said, an Associate Professor in the Department of English Studies at the University of the Western Cape, and is a great researcher, NRF B-rated researcher, which takes, most of you will know, takes a lot of research and output. And yeah, in African literature. I don't, Kamil, Fiona, sorry, I didn't take down the notes of your specialty with your interest in romance novels, am I right? Gosh, this is getting, I'll leave it at that for now.
Monday. Yeah, Fiona actually taught me when I was a wayward second year and introduced me to Nuruddin Farah.
That's what I was name I was looking
area
for.
For research. So I owe a lot to you as well, Fiona.
Okay, thank you, Kamil. I just want to say that it's a real privilege for you to be my colleague now in the Department of English at the University of the Western Cape. I was not going to divulge that you were my second year student because it puts me just in an entirely different generation from yourself, which I can't say I'm too happy about. But it's a real privilege now to work with you. And it's an absolute privilege to have read your book twice. Okay, I enjoyed it that much and found it so intriguing.
Thank
so
you.
You have summarized and I'm actually going to address my my comments and my questions. I'm going to address them to you directly rather than to the audience whom I can't really see and feel a bit disembodied. So I'm going to speak to you, Kamil. And so you've presented a summary of your book, which is quite detailed and quite complex. Okay, so I would like now to present my own summary of your book, which I think is a little bit more simplistic. And then based on my understanding of your book, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Okay.
Great.
So the focus of your book is on the crime genre, right? How it's been used and how it's been transformed as it grapples with social justice issues in post-colonial contexts, okay? But your focus is even more specific than that. With regard to the protagonist, and in this case, of course, it's the detective, your interest lies not in the local detective, but in the exiled or diasporic or migrant detective who comes back home, okay? And that idea of home is a very difficult one. The home the returnee detective comes back to, in all cases considered in the novels, is radically unhomely, since the post-colonial nation into which the returnee detective arrives is riven by tension, if not in the full throes of civil war, okay? This very specifically delimited subgenre of crime fiction is contrasted in your book with golden age detective fiction, of which I guess Sherlock Holmes and the Agatha Christie mystery novels may be considered examples. So what characterizes the golden age or classical genre is the encounter by the detective of a mystery or a disorder in the social fabric. This disorder is then confronted by the detective and resolved. So thus it is a literature of containment, and I'm quoting your quotation there. It's a literature of containment. It's a literature which makes safe, right? So the central tension in the classic genre is the conflict between good and evil, which is resolved in closure. Closure provides narrative cohesion and certainty, again, quoting your quotes. The relative regularity of closure through cohesion and certainty gives the detective fiction genre the reputation of being formulaic, and for that reason, simple and not very profound. So many critics provocatively suggest that a crime fiction writer, regardless of how good the writer may be, would never win the Nobel Prize for Literature. I'm not sure what your thoughts are about this. However, through iterating, but also challenging the conventions of crime fiction, the post-colonial writers you consider question the assumptions of the classical genre. Instead of presenting the Olympian resolution provided by the supremely rational detective, the novels you consider breach or explode the form to render a morally complicated or chaotic world. And those are your words. They reveal a world of ambivalence, contradiction, irony. In short, a world where the line between good and evil is not clear, and where often perpetrators and investigators may be in collusion, and where there are no ultimate truths. In this context, the returnee detective is both a stranger and is familiar. The returnee detective is both an insider and an outsider. Given the complexities of the subgenre you consider, the term used by Michael Holquist is especially apt. The novels you look at are examples of what Holquist terms the metaphysical detective story. Holquist defines metaphysical detective stories as narratives which subvert crime fiction conventions to provoke existential and cognitive disquiet through defamiliarization. So Kamil, you look at 5 novels. The one is set in China, the other one in Sri Lanka, the third one in Guatemala, then also South Africa and Somalia, okay? And the chapters in which you consider these novels are like pearls on a string, since there's no, since they are each encapsulated pearls, gems of their own, rather than conforming to an overarching umbrella theme or argument, okay? The only thread that is running through all of them is the figure of the returnee detective and the fraught post-colonial social and political context. The individual chapters map wide backgrounds and paint fascinating foregrounds, but I'm going to zero in only on the figure of the returnee detective. So I'm going to look at the returnee detective in each of the 5 novels. So in Kazuo Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans, we are presented with the protagonist, Christopher Banks, who returns to Shanghai to track his family history. He is especially concerned to discover the truth about the disappearance of both his parents when he was a child. The conventional authority of the classic detective is seriously undercut in Christopher, since he is presented as very human and very fallible, and for that reason, a significantly unreliable narrator. Christopher only gains authority and reliability when he abandons his untenable, possibly chauvinistic assumptions about national and cultural identity, especially English identity and English British culture. I think I need to admit at this point that apart from the from Nuruddin Farah's novel, I actually haven't read any of the other novels. So I hope I'm summing them up correctly. In Michael Ondaiki's Anil's Ghost, Anil Tessera is a pathologist who returns to her native Sri Lanka to determine how a skeleton nicknamed Sailor came to meet his end. Revealing the context of Sailor's death will also expose the atrocities of the government. As much as this forensic thriller is about solving the crime, it is also about a reconciliation of Anil's citizenship. Is Anil a foreign outsider, or is she one of us, a Sri Lankan? Anil's unstable citizenship determines the significance and impact of her interventions. In the 3rd chapter, we are presented with Roger Graetz, I think one pronounces the surname. So Roger Graetz is the multicultural returnee detective of Francisco Goldman's The Long Night of the White Chickens. He's the son of a working-class Jewish father and a patrician Guatemalan mother, exiled in Boston, America. Roger returns to Guatemala, where he tries to investigate the murder of the beautiful Flor de Mayo, who was in a complex relationship with him, where she was at once sister, servant, and beloved. She was everything all at once and also none of these things. Roger's quest is questionable, since it is more about exploring his own identity than it is about Flor and her murder. Furthermore, the novel exposes the unstable ground of Roger's judgments, given that he is shown to have colluded with the complex forces which lead to Flor's death. Unlike the returnee detective of Ishiguro's novel, Roger does not appear to gain insight into the complexities, contradictions, ambiguities, and ironies of his mission to find who killed Flor. In Gillian Slovo's Red Dust, Sarah Barkant returns to a small South African hometown to represent a client at a TRC hearing. The novel presents the unmaking of the hard-boiled, high-heeled, tough chick woman detective who needs to recognize that as an individualist litigator, she is out of place in the context of the TRC, with its privileging of community engagement and the value of subjective testimony. The complexity of the ending suggests that apartheid is not a case to be solved by a tenacious loner, but requires a different kind of protagonist. Those are your very wise words there. Apartheid is not a case to be solved by a tenacious loner, but requires a different kind of protagonist. In the final chapter, Nuruddin Farah's Crossbones presents two diasporic part Somali brothers, Malik and Al, who return to the homeland they have never seen, Somalia. Malik, a journalist, tries to uncover the truth about the Somali civil war, while Al arrives to try to find his stepson, who has joined Al-Shabaab. Needless to say, as is the case in most Farah novels, there is no solution, only dissolution. So at this point, I'd really like to compliment Kamil on the clarity of the lines of her arguments and her discretion and the discretion of her use of detective fiction scholarship. I discovered that there is masses and masses of detective fiction scholarship. So the way in which you've used that scholarship shows is very strategic and very smart, I think. So the novels that Kamil studies may be ambivalent and contradictory, but her analyses certainly are not. So based on my understanding of the novels as you have presented them through your book, I've got 4 questions for you. I'm going to ask them all at once, but then if you need me to go through them again, we can chat about them one by one. So my first question, are these the only novels which fit the returnee detective Civil War paradigm, or are there others? If there are others, what principle governed your selection of these particular texts? That's question 1. Question 2, and I think you've partially answered this one already, but maybe through introducing the comparative element, you can take the ideas a little bit further. Why the interest in the returnee detective? You've already answered that one. What issues does the returnee figure introduce which are not opened up by the local detective? So maybe focus more on the comparison between the returnee detective and the local detective. There's only returnee detective. Is the genre and this particular subgenre still largely male? And if that is the case, why? And final question, would you say that genre fiction is burgeoning in the post-colonial context, especially Africa? Perhaps they've just come to me by chance, but I've been discovering more and more interventions into genre fiction, like romance fiction, science fiction, in addition to the crime fiction you consider. So why do you think there is this flowering of interest in genre fiction? It looks to me as though you've got all of that. I don't have to go through it again.
I might ask you to go through a couple of those again.
Okay.
But yeah, there's certainly other novels which use this trend and this kind of trope. As to why I chose these ones, I think When We Were Orphans is the sort of proto-specimen of these books in a way, because it's very sort of overtly about the Golden Age genre. It's explicitly, referencing Sherlock Holmes throughout, and looking at the idea of Golden Age or traditional detective fiction being sort of inseparable from ideas of English exceptionalism and the sort of British imperialism and the sort of myths behind that. So when that sort of generic dream vanishes in the book, I think there are all these other sort of associations which come tumbling down to do with British identity, essentialism, exceptionalism, and also the sort of Orientalist notions that you get in a lot of this Golden Age fiction. It is always a kind of idea of evil sort of seeping inwards, the center under siege from the empire. We get these very sort of racialized kind of portraits of that. That was a very like obvious choice for me because it's so stylized. It's so very referential of a particular kind of detective fiction. And slightly different from the others in that it's not strictly a civil war situation, and it is set quite a bit earlier than the others, but I felt that the stylistic elements were a good introduction to the idea of the genre. And also we have a very dramatic return by the detective. The others, I think, do have a sort of commonality, especially if we look at Anil's Ghost, for example. There's an overlap with The Long Night of White Chickens. We learned that Anil was in Guatemala doing sort of similar forensic work there. And I like the idea of the ways in which both of them approach the sort of international situation at the time. We don't hear a lot about it in Anil's Ghost, whereas in The Long Night of White Chickens is very preoccupied with the Cold War, the supposed sort of language of rescue that goes along with American interventions, particularly in Latin America. So I thought that was interesting. They make for an interesting comparison because while Anil's Ghost doesn't suggest the sort of role that the West has played at all, except sort of very obliquely and not clearly surface kind of way. I thought it was interesting that every single thing that happens in The Long Night of White Chickens is saying that this relationship that Roger and Flora have had is basically began as a relationship of indentured labor between her and his family. They sort of employed her as a domestic servant in their house, and she becomes much more, but it reflects these kind of dynamics of codependence, neocolonialism, really, and this deep investment that the USA has in Guatemala. They're kind of inseparable from each other. So when Roger goes sort of looking for himself and looking for Flor, it's not an apolitical searching. He's sort of constantly self-accusing and looking at things that happened in America and seeing the ways in which these are now affecting this other country that many of the people he knows in the USA have never really heard of. He keeps trying to sort of mention this terrible conflict that's happening in Guatemala, and nobody is really giving him the time of day or listening to it. And I like the fact that in this book, there's a world-making project within the book as well. The detectives are putting together a chronicle. And the local detective is quite interesting because he says he knows it's not going to go anywhere and there will be no justice. But this doesn't mean that it should not be written down. And his running kind of catchphrase throughout the book is Guatemala no existe. Guatemala doesn't exist. So in fact, his investigation is not so much about seeking revelation and justice, which he thinks is an impossibility because there's nothing approaching what he would consider rule of law. But he wants to make Guatemala exist on the world stage. And he's doing this by showing the complete impossibility of the investigation through his sort of report. Red Dust, I think, is interesting in that it differs in that it's sort of post-conflict, but in that very heated moment where people are uncertain about what's going to happen in South Africa. And I just thought it was quite fascinating the way in which it uses real sort of evidence that was actually presented at the TRC. We have an apartheid policeman who's very closely modeled on Jeffrey Benzine and some of the sort of famous scenes that came out of some of those Truth Commission recordings. So, but by adding this notion of interiority and giving the thoughts behind what the perpetrators might have been sort of ruminating about while they're on the stand, it sort of shows that an act of contrition is not the same as actual contrition. So there's a very sort of focused look at the performative elements. And I wonder if this is some sort of national ritual of performance, rather than something that's going to promote individual healing. And there's the question at the end of, whether it was worth it. As far as novel Crossbones, I was just fascinated about, because I love the way it's set up in the beginning to be asking about, puzzles and riddles and mysteries that need to be cleared up in the matter of Akhlil, who has been radicalized and now disappeared into Somalia, and nobody knows where. But what I sort of really responded to in the novel is the way in which it is very worldly in the way it makes its connection. We have the constant presence of sort of drones overhead. We have the sort of remote control warfare happening all the time. And every construct is sort of broken down. So maybe one of the mysteries the journalist Malik is looking at is, what does it mean to be a Somali pirate? But the closer he gets to sort of interrogating this idea, the more he realizes this is a kind of stock image that's been put in the media. It becomes more and more complex instead of less so. So I like that kind of unraveling, and I thought it was a really interesting way of doing it, sort of similar to Goldman, except instead of adding possibilities, there's a sort of emptiness at the heart of the story, and things recede as the detective figures get closer. And a kind of renunciation of narrative authority, I think. Farah is not telling us what pirates really are or who they are. He's just rendering them more and more complicated as it goes on and making us sort of question our assumptions. Sorry, Fiona, I've forgotten what your next question was. You remind me.
Okay, the next question, why the specific interest in the returnee detective rather than the local detective? And you already said a few things about that. You said the returnee detective introduces questions of sort of identity and multiculturalism, and also opens up a world political dimension in the narrative. But perhaps you could compare the returnee detective with your experience of local detectives. Is there anything in addition that you could say if you compare the two figures?
I think an interesting element of a lot of the returnee detectives in the stories is their attitude to morality. They are trying to bring a sort of universal morality to the situation that they're in. They take it for granted that revelation is a good thing, but of course it can lead to, a chain of violent consequences. So Anil of Anil's Ghost sort of blithely shows up in the middle of the civil war, and she says, the truth shall set you free. But everybody's telling her, no, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. It's a lot more dangerous, and, truth is not necessarily going to lead to justice, and in fact could lead to further violence, further problems. But I like that idea of sort of challenging the notions of morality that people are bringing to these scenes. I also think it's interesting. I compare sort of Edward Said's idea of contrapuntal thinking, which involves, he's talking about exiles sort of having two simultaneous viewpoints that can exist together. So working through attachments, he says, rather than rejecting them or discarding them. The idea that one can hold these two different places contrapuntally, vividly occurring together is what he said. So on a personal level, I really like that idea. I like the idea that it's taken from music as well, and suggests that there can be a kind of harmoniousness in the sort of diasporic or multicultural identity, or the search for that. And I think this is something that the characters often develop in the course of the narratives. But on the other hand, we have the contrast with Adorno saying the highest form of morality is not to be at home in one's own home. And this comes back to Anil again. She's very happy to judge everyone. She says scientific facts are the same. The same in Colombo as for Troy. And she is going to do everything she can to bring the same kind of values that she's had up until that point. So I think that's a very sort of interesting distinction. And I think it does make them sort of microcosms of the whole idea of international intervention in a way. But I also think, especially since a lot of the authors have a kind of diasporic identity, I think there are also some quite sort of interesting emotional aspects to the way in which each character deals with their status and feeling like an outsider and wondering what to do. So I look at that at a very kind of human level. But each of them sort of tends to have a counterpart who is trying to school them, you know, on the sort of inappropriateness of the kind of insights that they're bringing to the crime scene, and encouraging them to sort of develop more of an ethical imagination of what could go wrong instead of sort of sticking very rigidly to their moral ideas. In Anil Ghosh, Sarath says to Anil, I need you to understand the surrounding, the archaeological surround of a fact, which means a lot more than just forensic information. It means social information and consequences and nuance. I hope that answers the question.
It does very well, thank you. Once again, not ambiguous and not contradictory like the genre that you study. So I'm just going to remind you of the last two questions, and then I'm going to turn off my video and my mic, because I'm sure there are people with many other questions. So my last two questions, why does it seem from your selection that there are so few female returnee detectives and possibly female detectives in general? That's the one question. And the other, would you say that genre fiction is really growing apace in the post-colonial context? Thanks.
I'm not really sure about the gender distribution. I hadn't thought about it. So I should do. Yeah, we have two female returnee detectives in the stories, but mostly male authors. I think this might be a sort of effect of genre in general, rather than like my specific subgenre of it. Maybe people like writing about male detectives. I'm sure there's much like more intelligent answer, but I'll think about that because that would be interesting to take further. But thanks for that question. In terms of genre and post-colonial fiction and the relationships there, I do see a kind of increase in that, yeah, a burgeoning, as you said. I think that part of it is just that there's not the same stigma around genre fiction as there has been. There's a lot more sort of academic work on it now. There are a lot more, it's not seen so much as the sort of guilty pleasure genre as it was before. And I'll say that for a lot of different types of generic fiction. So part of it is that. I think also part of it though is this very kind of rigid and not very progressive form that we're used to looking at when we think of genre fiction. So it's very easy to adapt in a way that is striking and subversive and sort of shocking. As we see in some of these crime narratives that are withholding sort of expectation on the level of having the crime solved. But I mean, if we look at other kinds of genres, romance genres, for example, there are some that we see that are very much sort of, like when I think of romance novels, I probably think of the sort of swooning maiden covers that you see in bookshops, or the sort of paperbacks with like Fabio on the cover. So when I heard about that there's now a Nigerian imprint of romance novels, it's easy to see that, okay, this is subverting our expectations by taking us to a place where romance novels haven't traditionally been set, but also changing the aesthetic and having a very sort of valorizing of the African romantic hero, if you like, as opposed to Fabio. But of course, on the other hand, we still see some of the sort of heteronormative gender roles being kept in place. So it would be interesting to see, the different ways in which challenges occur in the genres. But I think it's interesting that each author has their own kind of individual take, but the things that they keep in place and the things that they choose to challenge. And it says a lot about ideology and world making as well. So I think that perhaps might be another reason. It's easy to make a strong point when you already have expectations to subvert. And an unlabeled novel doesn't kind of afford the same opportunity as one that is very clearly sort of generically pigeonholed. But I think that's it for the question portion there.
Is that are you happy with that, Fiona?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay. What I did say earlier was that I would, once we started talking, because I think everyone will agree, it's just such a fascinating genre to look at from a different point of view. And I've said to people that they could type in questions that they had, and I would ask them, or I don't know if can you see the chat, Kamil? Otherwise I can read the questions to you.
Could you read them, please?
Yeah, it'll be easier. From Baden Krill, he says, what would be your biggest piece of advice to an MA student who has started an endeavor in the field of postcolonialism? My interest is in the field of postcolonial drama, because I find myself reinventing the wheel time after time.
I think my advice would be to probably pick a narrow and interesting and doable subject, and not try to go for the big embrace of sort of all the wheels and all the topics. I think streamlining is probably key. Find something that you've noticed in text that you've enjoyed and kind of run with that. But I wouldn't, go too crazy trying to fit everything in and sort of explore a genre as a whole. I'd say find a trend that you find fascinating and keep to that. But in general, there's plenty of time to sort of expand on that and take in different directions. But no, an MA is a lot. So I would try and just write a great streamlined proposal and focus on that.
Byron, does that answer your question? I'm just going to, I just realized now, no, everyone should be able to unmute themselves. Okay. I'm just going to try and just unmute everyone. Byron, could you hear me?
Hello.
Did you get Kamil's answer?
Yeah, okay, yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thanks.
Okay. And then from another question from Herman Wittenberg, who says, Kamil, what do you see as the next step or steps? Is this a model that could be applied to more novels or adjacent genres? Or are you closing this chapter, so to speak, and taking your research in very different directions?
A little bit of both, I think. I think I'll be leaving the crime fiction for now, but I'm still very interested in genre fiction. And actually putting something together about sort of post-colonial feminist sci-fi right now. But in general, I think it would be interesting to take that image of the labyrinth, which happens in Goldman's novel, and I've kind of noticed it as a theme in a lot of Latin American writing. So I kind of like that to be a larger project about the precise post-colonial moment when freedom stops being a dream and starts being a very complicated labyrinth. And I think I'd like to sort of look at different contexts for that again, across different countries, but look at the way in which authors deal with that kind of transitional period. So a little bit of both.
Herman, you happy with that?
Kamil, thank you so much. I mean, that sounds fascinating, and I think this is such a great idea. You know, the transition from freedom to the dead end, the labyrinth, I think is such a cool way to think about a lot of fiction coming out of this colonial context. So great, thank you.
Thanks, Herman.
Thank you. Okay, another, it's just more of a statement, but well, I'm worried I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly. Kitty Ludovici. Sorry if I've mispronounced it. Post-colonial feminist science fiction sounds like something I would love to read. So does that maybe inform you, Kamil, about something else you'd like to research and write about?
Yeah, that makes me happy. I'm sort of in the very beginning stages of looking at that, but hopefully going to be contributing to an anthology on that at some point. So yeah, thank you, Kelly, for the support.
Any other questions? In fact, now you can actually, from Sarah, thank you so much, Sarah. She's great work. Sarah is, if anyone does not aware of it, Sarah Maswetsa is she's the CEO of the NIHSS, the National Institute of Human and Social Sciences. Sorry, I was looking at something else. And it really is thanks to Sarah and her team, Oriel, who I could see here, and Katlejo, being able to produce books like this, to make them available to an audience. Otherwise, they would never have been, they wouldn't have seen the light of day. As everyone knows, publishing books costs a lot of money. And I must thank NIHSS again for the investment in recognizing really good books to fund as we go along.
Yeah, Adele, I've just unmuted myself. I don't know how to raise my hand in this platform. Is it okay if I just ask one or two questions?
Yes, of course.
Thanks. And I'm hoping that I'm not bypassing anyone who's raised their hand. So, Adele, I think it's credit to publishers like UKZN Press, but also individuals behind the scenes like you who make this work possible. So I think you are thanking us. I think it is a tribute to you and UKZN for the amazing work that you have done since we've been established since 2013. To Kamil particularly, I mean, Kamil, I remember receiving your application for a PhD, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is incredible work. It will be great to see Kamil finally being called a doctor. And I know that wherever you are blushing about being called a doctor. Right. But you know, there's a number of your fellow alumni, NIHSS alumni, who want to know, one, what was the process of converting your PhD into a book? What were the easy parts and the difficult parts? Because there are many who want to follow in your footsteps, and there are also several who are already have embarked on the process. So I just wanted for you maybe to address that group of 300 odd these days who want to publish their PhDs, and maybe let me hear that part. And I think, you know, some of us write books for different reasons. Why was it important for you to write this book? Why was it, what compelled you to say, you know, of course I think it's a book, and why?
Yeah, I think I would give similar advice to the sort of MA question in a way. Those who are still writing their thesis, I sort of have very good advice from my supervisors to kind of write it as something that could easily be developed into a book. But I would say those who want to convert their thesis should enjoy the kind of little bit of freedom that changing it into a book offers. There's a lot more room for sort of musings and questions and additional things that there's not the same pressure as you have during a PhD, where everything has to be in a very specific format and substantiated at every turn. You can kind of take a reflective view as well, which I think is really nice. So I don't know, I think probably to think a little bit about intriguing the reader and just enjoy the process, as opposed to trying to sort of placate examiners and become a doctor, which is sort of a different kind of process.
Thank you so much. Know that you're doing incredible work and we are super proud of you. And I'm sure that there's lots more coming from you, and even your journey of being an academic now, I think resonates with who we are as NIHSS, and know that you can knock on our doors. It's your family now, has always been. Knock on our doors should you need any support. Again, big congratulations from us and Adele. Let's keep on doing this great work that you're doing. And Kamil, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. George, you've been wanting to ask a question. Sorry, are you been unmuted? Yeah.
Yes, I have. Thank you very much. I do have a question, but before that, and at the risk of embarrassing you, Kamil, I just want to say how incredibly proud I am to be involved in this. I think it was Fiona who said she didn't want to be, she realized in your introduction you'd put her in a different generation. Well, I am decidedly in a different generation too. I've watched you grow up, and nothing gives me greater pleasure and pride than to be here and asking you a question. So my question is this, actually, and the only one of your books, sadly, the ones you mentioned that I've read is Anil's Ghost, but I just wondered if it's fair to say that the returnee detective learns as much about himself or herself as they do about the kind of criminal puzzle they're trying to solve. And by learning about themselves, I'm really talking about their sort of cultural hinterland, their genetic hinterland, that kind of thing. And that's very much a part of this genre.
I think, yes, I think definitely there's those two kind of inquiries and journeys going on at the same time. And often a resistance in the beginning, with the detective kind of firmly saying that they are a visiting authority and they're going to act accordingly, but they find themselves sort of retracing their own steps. But yeah, I think it's very much about the sort of drama of multicultural identity and return, and often forms a substantial part of the books, although it's sort of dealt with in different ways. So Anil's Ghost got a fair bit of sort of criticism for this idea of sort of privileging the returnee character over the local characters and sort of having her drama be sort of central. But in different ways, I think all of the authors definitely use that kind of idea. I think Goldman, as I've said, uses that kind of Latin American boom kind of style, which is to talk about everything through the family drama. So there's a definite sort of intersection there with the personal and the political, and a definite journey through both, I think.
Okay. All right. Oh gosh, George, and not George, Barend, your message. Okay, I've sort of another question from Barend saying, how did you decide on the title of the book? Because it's quite apt, even if I say so myself.
Yeah, I kind of like the sort of punny nature of it. I think I thought it's playing on that idea of return to the scene of the crime. It brings those two worlds together of the returnee and the crime story. Actually quite sort of funnily, while I was at UCT, probably in my second year of my PhD, we had a visiting professor, Professor Abdul Jah Muhammad. And he was giving us a talk, and at one point he said, everybody's thesis is actually about them. And I hadn't actually sort of thought of this at all, really. But I mean, I have sort of return in my own background. That was an important thing for me to foreground in the book. And actually, sort of, my parents returned to South Africa in the early 90s with me along the way. I suppose had I been here, I would have been sort of in the nature of Trevor Noah calling himself being born a crime. So I guess return to the scene of the crime was quite apt and a little bit of a call back to that as well.
Thanks, Kamil. Anyone else for any questions? But we still have a few minutes and we can, don't be shy. You can even just type it and you don't have to show your face or your voice if that's what's worrying you. No more? Oh gosh, Jen. Oh, sorry, Jen Williams said, do you have a favorite character, a favorite chapter in your book?
I think probably the Guatemala chapter. I just found it fascinating, the different sort of layers and the kind of crazy sort of journey they go on, but also I kind of just love the character of the journalist Moolla. So that was kind of a joy to write about, using his little catchphrases. So that's probably my favorite chapter.
Everyone else? Anyone else for the question? No. Okay, I don't see any coming up now. Okay, well, if everyone's asked their questions, then all that's left is to say thank you to everyone for attending. And thanks again, Kamil and Fiona. And of course, as I said, Sarah and Oriel from NIHSS. Yeah, a book isn't made on its own. It isn't published on its own. It's a team of everyone, from the author to, well, the author's research, the author, the whole team of editing, etc., to get the book on the shelves. And again, just as a reminder, and I think I did put in the chat, Loot, for some reason, have given, because I probably must be the launch, that they've given us they're selling this at a fabulous price. I mean, they've marked down, I think, about a quarter. It's not going to last for long. So please go ahead and click through and place your order. The only downside of Zoom launches is that unfortunately Kamil can't sign them. But yeah, you can know that you're part of the launch. Yeah, and then congratulations again, Kamil, from our side as well. You've been I agree with George, because it's from everyone. Everyone has enjoyed working with you from our team, and we look forward to more.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for coming. It really means a lot to me.
Great. Okay. And thanks, Fiona, who's also, I don't know if you saw the message, she said, thank you, UKZN Press, NIHSS, and Kamil, and farewell. And I think that even the farewell is, because it looks like two words, and it's actually, I think, as one word or the two words, I think that's actually quite appropriate as well, and probably an appropriate way to end the launch now. This launch has been recorded, and what I will do, it'll be up on our YouTube page, but I will put it on our Facebook page as well. And if anyone here maybe isn't on Facebook, if you are, please follow UKZN Press and NIHSS. Otherwise, you're welcome to email me, and let me just put my email in here quickly. Right, it's just brancher@ukzn.ac.za. Thanks everyone, and have a good evening further.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks all, bye.